Iowa, a state abundant in natural resources and blessed with fertile soils, considered by most U.S. citizens as flyover country, and most commonly associated with corn and pigs. Iowa is so much more. In fact, you might say we're downright nuts. Blame can squarely be placed on the Iowa Nut Growers Association, a passionate group of growers, hobbyists, breeders, nut enthusiasts, nurserymen, and a few folks that are just plain nuts.
We made many selections from the native pecans, and we've taken them to Nebraska, and they have them in trial out there. And some of the selections that were made have proven to be pretty productive. One of the early ripening ones was the Iowa pecan, and it has got a decent crop this year, even after the flood of last year and then the drought of this year. I have them on an upland site, which is not probably ideal, but it is producing a good crop this year. The Mulhay pecan is probably one of the largest pecans, and that has been adopted by some of the growers south of here because of its size. It's an excellent cracking nut, good producing nut, and it's proven to be a good resource for, I think, another generation or two from those seed sources that we have isolated orchards of selected varieties. Those will make excellent seed sources for distribution throughout Iowa right now.
Tom, many folks are interested in nut options that can actually generate some income. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the best prospect right now is chestnuts, even though they can't be grown in all parts of Iowa. They have a very well-established market. In fact, it's a bottomless pit of a market. There's no chance of overproduction of chestnuts within the lifetimes of many generations from now. Excellent price. It's a high-value crop, even when compared to other high-value crops. 10 to 12 times more profitable per acre than pecans or hazelnuts, for example. It's the third most important crop economically in China, behind only rice and wheat, ahead of corn and soybeans. It is the third most in-demand nut worldwide, behind only coconuts and peanuts, and ahead of almonds plus all types of walnuts.
That is impressive and provides some excellent context. So Tom, give us a few pointers on getting started with growing chestnuts.
Well, the very first thing you have to have for chestnut production is well-drained soil. Chestnuts will not tolerate poor drainage. They also need soil on the acid side of the pH scale, ideally 5.5 to 6.5. They will tolerate a little bit higher and quite a bit lower, but the ideal range is that 5.5 to 6.5. Also, cold hardiness can be an issue, especially for pure Chinese chestnuts. In the northern parts of Iowa, where it gets too cold, hybrid chestnuts, hybrids between Chinese and Americans, may be the more logical to grow, since they're more cold hardy and able to take temperatures down to 50 below zero, whereas the straight Chinese chestnuts are limited to about 30 below zero. Now, I recommend starting out at a 20 by 20 foot spacing, which is approximately 100 trees per acre. Research has shown that chestnut pollen doesn't travel very far, and since chestnuts are not self-fertile, you have to have cross-pollination. And chestnuts are not good at cross-pollinating beyond about 30 feet. So if you start out at 40 foot by 40 foot spacing, you won't get any nut production for maybe the first 15 to 20 years. If, on the other hand, you start out at 20 by 20 spacing, then about the time the trees are big enough to start bearing nuts, they're also close enough together for efficient cross-pollination. Then, at some point, maybe 15 to 20 years down the road, they will need to be thinned eventually down to 40 by 40 foot spacing.
Let's talk a little bit about cultivars and seedlings versus grafting. Tell us a little bit about that.
I have cultivars, but mostly seedlings. And seedlings seem to be just as profitable as as even the very best cultivars,
Is there a
if
need
the
to
seedlings are coming from good genetics. Grafting is done, as Greg Miller puts it, whether you want to grow grafted trees or seedling trees depends on which set of problems you'd rather deal with. Whether you grow grafted or seedling trees, to me anyway, is really dependent on the ultimate size of the operation you're interested in. With a smaller operation like 3 acres or less, seedling trees are perfectly okay. One person can harvest 3 acres of seedling trees, no problem. Harvesting every day for up to 6 weeks. If your operation is going to be 10 acres or larger, you'd be much better off with grafted trees, since the grafted trees concentrate the harvest, because any one variety, any one cultivar chestnuts will drop the majority of its nuts over about a 3 to 5 day period. So, for example, you could plant a whole row to one variety and then have a different variety on either side of it. You could harvest that one row in a 3 to 5 day period and then not have to go back to that row the rest of the season. Whereas with seedling trees, each seedling has its own unique ripening time that could spread over a 6-week period. So if you have all seedlings, you have to harvest every acre every day for up to 6 weeks. And for 10 acres or more, that's inconvenient. Well, one of the differences between seedlings and grafted trees is grafted trees come into production earlier, typically even as early as 1 year after planting, but their production increases at a slower rate because grafted trees grow slower than seedling trees. It takes them more years to reach their maximum level of production. That said, seedling trees can begin bearing as early as 2 years after planting. So the benefit of going to grafted trees in that respect is negligible. But typically you can expect the first nuts between 3 and 5 years after planting, assuming everything is done right as far as planting good quality stock, planting on a good site, doing the planting properly, and doing after planting maintenance. If all that is done and you don't get a drought or a late frost, average 3 to 5 years to the first nut production, but it goes up very quickly from there, and they can plateau at a more or less mature level of production as early as 15 years after planting.
At that point, what would you estimate production to be?
In Iowa, we think the mature level of production will probably be 3,500 to 4,000 pounds per acre.
That's a lot of nuts. So explain how we get these things harvested.
I prefer to have the chestnuts falling onto grass. It keeps them cleaner that way, besides protecting the soil from erosion. I don't like to see bare soil under trees, so what I recommend as far as maintenance is, even before the trees are planted, establish a ground cover that is compatible with the trees. And my current recommendation is for a mix of turf-type perennial ryegrass, not forage-type, plus fine-leaved fescue, such as peeping red fescue, hard fescue, or chewings fescue, plus a little bit of Dutch white clover as a mix. That makes a ground cover that resists encroachment by weeds, resists soil erosion, yet it is compatible with the root systems of the trees without being too competitive. We tried a number of harvesting methods. At first we did hand harvesting, which is the method of harvest most prevalent across the world, but not so popular in America. We don't like to do things by hand. So we tried a number of different machines. I tried a lawn sweeper, which was very good at sweeping up the burrs, but not so good at sweeping up nuts. I tried a machine called a Butternuts, which was fairly efficient, but only on a very, very narrow size range of nuts, and it would leave the smaller and larger nuts behind. I looked at but didn't actually try a motorized machine called the Savage Pecan harvester. At best, it was only about 60% efficient. What we finally settled on is a very simple and inexpensive machine called a Nut Wizard. It's approximately 10 times faster than picking up by hand. The machine only costs about $50 a piece. and I can run one all day long without ever having to bend over once. As far as I'm concerned, there just isn't anything that can beat that machine. That said, regardless of your method of harvest, chestnuts have to be harvested from very short grass. You cannot harvest chestnuts from tall grass. It just doesn't work. And the shorter the grass, the better, the easier the harvest. Ken Hunt at the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry harvested 10,000 pounds of chestnuts by himself with one nut wizard. So that shows what the machine can do.
What sort of processing is required to sell your crop?
Chestnuts require no processing, at least not by the grower. They're sold almost 100% sold as fresh in-shell nuts to the customer. And the customer does the processing. The customer will cure the nuts and then peel them by hand, usually, in the home.
Like Tom Wall, member Jeff Jensen also believes that perennial crops that include nut trees and shrubs are a vital component of agriculture going forward. With an eye to the future, he has been involved with the development of hybrid hazelnuts as a perennial crop for the upper Midwest. Hybrid hazelnuts have lots of potential as a valuable perennial crop for much of the upper Midwest. These perennial shrubs can be quite productive. They produce a valuable nut that is high in monounsaturated oil, similar to olive oil, and tastes great. However, challenges are present. Perennial crop breeding is a necessarily long and drawn-out affair. Unlike annuals, where crosses can be made and then grown out immediately, perennial plant breeding requires several years of evaluation for parent plants, and then several more years after crosses have been made to evaluate the offspring. This is where organizations like the Iowa Nut Growers Association and the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, what we sometimes refer to as UMD, can be most valuable. Through feedback from members that are growing these plants all over the state and the Midwest, we can gain valuable data that can help narrow our search for better plants that can support this infant industry.
About 1982, 83, I was reading a book about tree crops just down at the local library, and it described the northern nut growers and the special black walnuts. I was able to find a person in Connecticut, and he said, well, your president of the northern nut growers is in Iowa at Beaver, Archie Sparks. Hey, that's the guy I'm looking for. So I called him and we chatted, and this was in the fall of 82. And he says, well, come to our meeting in January. And this is an annual nut evaluation at Ames. And he said, you'll see some really good black walnuts. And this was just really an eye-opener to us, because these thin shell, big kernel nuts, and this is exactly what we're looking for. So I cornered Archie, and he agreed to graft 50 trees for us and make the correct selections. Gave us background for how to set up our orchard, and it became real clear that Archie this guy was really intelligent and somebody I could communicate with. He was self-taught, but well respected by the people in academics, and it just seemed to me that this was the way to start. And that spring we got our first 50 trees, and we planted them just the way Archie suggested. And his selections, and that was a critical thing about Archie. He really understood black walnuts. It was his passion. His whole life started with those, I think. And he was interested in identifying early ripening, mid-season, and late season. Some of those were his own selections, like S127, which is a early ripening, high-yielding, thin-shell, annual producer. It produces not only on the end shoots but offshoots, so it was just a superior tree. He also selected an older cultivar, one of the first ones identified, called Sparrow, and that's early ripening. The mid-season, he preferred S147 and Quick Crop. Quick Crop is an older one propagated by Stark Brothers in Missouri, sold. And S147's his selection. Well, it turns out to be one of the highest yielding kernels black walnuts in the nation, or maybe even in the world, and still is. It is just a superior nut.
The butternut has seemed to be something that many people are fascinated with. It's probably not as easy to crack and extract the nut meats, but it's a very hardy tree, grown in Minnesota, Ontario. It's a hardy nut. When I first came to become interested in growing nuts, it was I saw an article in Organic Gardening. It's about English walnuts or carpathian nuts, a new kind of a nut that was hardy, and had a picture of Frank Kosak sitting there with a couple of big bushels of English walnuts, and I thought, man, that's the thing to have. And most people don't know that the Carpathian or the hardy English walnut, you can get them to come out of the husk. You don't have to. They drop free from the tree and they're ready to go. You don't have to husk them out. And I thought that was just perfect. I would just start to grow English walnuts, and this is something new and worth the effort. Well, I made an attempt to grow them, and I found out that they don't grow in the bottom due to the flooding and due to the frost. You need to have an upland site, you need to have a lot of warm weather and some good growing conditions that sometimes we don't have in Iowa, but we've made some progress in that line, and we're looking for late vegetating types that are resistant to the frost, and this year has proven that to be true, that the later vegetating types we were able to get some crop off of those.
Tom, we know that chestnuts have lots of potential as a profitable nut crop. What are your thoughts on any other opportunities?
Another good possibility is Heartnuts. They can be grown across a wider geographic area in Iowa. Potentially very profitable. People who grow them have no trouble selling them at $4 or $5 a pound. They're very productive, fast growing. There are some challenges with those, though. They have some disease susceptibility problems. Also, Heartnuts probably need to be grafted. Seedling Heartnuts tend to throw back to wild type and produce nuts that are not commercially valuable, necessitating growing grafted varieties. And they are a challenge to graft. Heartnuts actually are the best cracking of all walnuts. It is the only walnut that can be cracked and extracted whole kernels, unbroken kernels, consistently. They're also the sweetest and mildest tasting of all walnuts. They beat out so-called English walnuts in taste tests every time. Black walnuts are under severe threat from thousand canker disease, while Heartnuts appear so far to be resistant to thousand canker disease.
The future of Iowa is nuts! The future of Iowa is nuts!
Funds for this project were provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Specialty Crops Block Grant Program through the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. For more information or to become a member of the Iowa Nut Growers Association, visit our website at iowanutgrowers.org.